Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show where we use literature, culture, and other things from Canadian history and its past to talk about, Canadian history and its past.
We use the past to talk about the present and predict the future.
Yep. What are we going to predict the future of today, Mac?
Everything's going to burn.
Okay.
Everything is burning. That's the present.
There you go. I think that's the present right now. So what's the future? More burns? We're going to come
all the
full
people
circle.
that are ruining the earth are going to take off in the spaceships.
Okay.
And then the rest of us are going to have to try and figure out how to put it all back together.
Wonderful.
You can sort of say that we're on a one-stop train going in one direction.
Interesting. Why do you say that?
Because we're talking about the railway today.
Yeah. So we finally are coming to, I guess, one of the big poobahs of Canadian history and Canada in general, right? The CPR, the railroad.
The biggest part of Canadian history.
Getting
the
railed.
railroad.
There are a bunch of railing jokes that we can make. We're going to try to avoid them as much as possible for the sake of professionalism, but I guarantee nothing because we're two immature people. Before we get started, we would like to thank our newest patron to the show, Noah. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Noah.
For that. Noah is one of many, I think, patrons who support us at $3 a month and who get not only ad-free episodes, but extra episodes every month. So thank you very much for all our wonderful patrons on that end.
Rock and roll.
All right. So as we were saying before, right, we're going to be talking about the railway, but I don't want to talk about necessarily the actual construction of the famous Trans-Canada Railway, right? The one that literally was a factor in making Canada what it is today. Because there have been a lot of books, there have been a lot of podcasts, there have been a lot of movies about the construction of the railway itself, right? There's a bunch of...
No way.
Yeah.
Wild.
Shock and awe, right? But I think it would be interesting to kind of talk about what the idea or the symbol of the railway is, like why it's such a powerful symbol.
To build a wall against America.
I mean, that's not entirely wrong.
I know it's not entirely wrong. That's why I said it.
We'll get to that, but it's not 100. It's not quite. I know it's a joke today to say that we're building walls, but also it's not really a joke in this case.
No, it was a way to connect, literally connecting all the lower part of Canada. So that way they would be united and create a cultural wall to prevent absorption by the United States.
Not just cultural, but economic as well.
That was the bigger one, honestly.
Yeah.
The economic absorption.
Absolutely. It's intrinsic in most of the Canadian nation building project is, and you see this in speeches and personal letters that politicians would send to each other. It's an economic motive first and foremost, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, getting into it, I thought it would be interesting to kind of start with a book called Ocean to Ocean, which I think has kind of been forgotten today as a text. But at least the idea of ocean to ocean is one I think still permeates into the Canadian consciousness, right? Or at least we understand it now as from sea to sea, right? We've kind of adopted that one. But the idea of a continent spanning literally oceans in this case, or a country spanning many oceans and seas is, I think, an important one. No, but I think it actually changed from sea to sea when we went up north, right? Because there's the Arctic Sea up there that we touch, and then that's when it becomes sea to sea to sea. But for our purposes here in the 19th century, during the construction of the railway, it's still ocean to ocean. That makes sense.
Still going from Atlantic to Pacific.
Yep.
Because we still thought there was a Northwest Passage.
Well, that's kind of what's interesting. And we're not going to talk in depth about Ocean to Ocean as a text because it's 500 pages long. And because we have other poems that we're going to be, other literature that we're going to be talking about. That is perhaps more frustrating to read than Ocean to Ocean, but I'm not sure about that. But the reason why I wanted to talk about Ocean to Ocean first was because I feel it offers a good setup for the drive and the imperative behind the building of the railway. Right.
Cool.
So have you ever heard of this text? Just out of curiosity.
Which one? Ocean to Ocean?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So it's basically a travel text, right? It's a travel text. We've talked about them before. They're important in the building of empire, in the building of Canada as an idea, right? And as a nation, and most American countries, honestly. Most nations in the world, actually, to be perfectly honest.
Travel journals, travel stories build the foundation of our understanding of how people understood the things around them.
Yeah, exactly. And this is no different in many ways, although this was explicitly so. You could argue that a lot of travel literature was not deliberately meant to allow for this. It was just like a lot of them were diaries and logs that people kept, and they've been retroactively made into national narratives. This one, I would argue, was explicitly meant as that. Mm-hmm. And so it was written by a certain George Monroe Grant. Who shows up in like many parts of Canadian history. He was president at Queen's University in Kingston from 1877 until his death. He was also a very vocal proponent of public school. And as we'll see a little bit here, the idea of what we call Canadian imperialism, right? Which is basically this idea that Canada should have a greater place within the British Empire and even surpass Britain as the center of empire. Right?
At Canada?
Yes. That was a genuine strain of thought for in the late 19th century.
Like that was a thing for a lot of people. Didn't Wilfrid Laurier say that the 20th century was going to be the century of Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. But Laurier,
but then bombs, wars,
and yeah, exactly. American exceptionalism kind of shot through the roof. But no, the difference with Laurier was that he was thinking, at least in a much more national perspective, of Canada as its own thing in many ways. Whereas the Canadian imperialists like Grant still wanted specifically those imperial ties. Like they did not want to see the end of the British Empire as a thing, but they wanted it to shift its focus from Britain as the center to Canada as the center. And part of that was because they believed that Canada had morally and politically was better than Britain was at this point, which they saw as kind of decadent. It's a weird circuitous logic, honestly. We're not going to get too much into it, but it's an interesting thought process to kind of delve into. So the actual text of Ocean to Ocean was written in throughout 1872 and published in 1873, right? So a bit before the actual railway was even begun. And it was written while Monroe Grant acted as secretary to a certain Sanford Fleming, who was the chief engineer of the Canadian Pacific Railway. Right. And it basically chronicles the journey that Fleming and Grant and their team make from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean in search of the best route for the railway. Right. So it's literally a mapping process here. And as we've talked about before, maps are vital, again, like to creating a sense of nationhood and control, right? So it's kind of intrinsic already in this railway building project, is that we're establishing control of the Canadian land, right?
Whoa.
Sure. Sanford Fleming, by the way, we're not going to talk a whole lot about him, but I know there are other resources out there that I will link to. Sanford Fleming is also known not just as the chief engineer for the CPR, but he was also one of the first, or one of the major proponents, and he's credited with the idea of the 24-hour clock time zone, right?
Oh,
yeah. Like it was an idea before him, but he's kind of credited as like the one who heavily influenced the creation of a coordinated universal time that we use today.
Universal time?
Yeah. So he's not like a nobody either. He kind of fundamentally changed the way that we perceive time itself, which is kind of wild.
God damn it.
Right?
How we perceive time.
I mean, am I wrong though?
No. It's true.
It's he also designed Canada's first postage stamp. And
why didn't you lead with that? That's so much bigger
than time itself.
Time is a concept.
Exactly. Time is a flat circle. Anyway.
Time is a concept, but postage.
Now that's
a concrete institution. What are we supposed to do without postage? You think I'm memeing?
I mean, just send an email, I think. Even in 1874, just send an email.
Send an email. Send a raven.
A pigeon. And yeah, he was also a founding member of the Royal Society of Canada. So in many ways, Fleming is emblematic of creating a modern sensibility and a modern Canada, right? In many ways, or at least a Canada that can stand its own on an international scale. Royal societies, its own institutions, its own inventors that create, coordinated universal time, which is madness, right? But it does make sense, right? That this person, that Fleming and Grant and others would be so related and intrinsically tied to the creation of institutions like time zones, right?
Zones.
Right. Because when you think about it, if your goal is to create a nation that literally spans a whole continent, right? You need to think about the logistics of it, right, in many ways. And I think this book very much represents it, Ocean to Ocean, right? Where you see Grant's thought process, right, as he's carefully recording place names or idioms, and he talks about native and Métis cultures that he encounters, and specifically assesses the land's suitability for settlement, right? So it's not just finding a perfect route, but it's finding a perfect route that will best create Canada. Right. This is an intrinsic part of the story that he's crafting. And I think it really is summed up by the first paragraph of the book, which I think is the only part that I'll read. Or if you want to read it, go ahead. I don't know if you have it open in front of you.
Hold on.
The introductory part.
Yeah. Ocean to Ocean, Chapter 1, Introductory, the Travel 1,000.
Yeah, go ahead, read that for our listeners.
Travel 1,000 miles up a great river, more than another 1,000 along Great Lakes, and a succession of smaller lakes, 1,000 miles across rolling prairies, and another 1,000 through woods and over 3 great ranges of mountains. And you have traveled from ocean to ocean through Canada. All this country is a single colony of the British Empire, and this colony is dreaming magnificent dreams of a future when it shall be the Greater Britain, and the highway across which the fabrics and products of Asia shall be carried to the eastern as well as to the western sides of the Atlantic. Mountains were once thought to be effectual barriers against railways, but that day has gone by. And now that trains run between San Francisco and New York over summits of 8,200 feet, it is not strange that they should be expected soon to run between Victoria and Halifax over a height of 3,700 feet. At any rate, and the Canadian Pacific Railway has been undertaken by the Dominion, and as this book consists of notes made in connection with the survey, an introductory chapter may be given to a brief history of the project.
I think this sums up pretty well, like, the idea that we're going for here.
Oh, God, yeah. It does a very good job of even saying why it existed. Because, hey, they're going to have one going in America. We need one, too.
Yep. Actually, it's already existing in America. Now that trains run between San Francisco and New York. So, like, we need to catch up. Right? Because, and I think this was a specific... this was something that was specifically addressed, right? If the Americans start going northward with their trains, then we're screwed, right? So we need to create an east-west train in order to establish our control over the thousands of miles of rolling prairies and woods and great mountain ranges. In order
we need it so that we can say we're a country, we're a nation.
Yep, absolutely. And it is interesting. I think you have traveled from ocean to ocean through Canada. So this was in 1873, and a lot of these places were still considered territories or part of the Northwest, or part of like what was before the Hudson's Bay Company. But Grant is still portraying it as this is Canada, right? And honestly, very much a land-based sense of what the country is. Not a single mention, by the way, of the indigenous populations or even the settlements that are there by other.
Just the idea.
Yeah, it's just the idea of it.
The idea of Canada.
Absolutely.
That's what's always been about.
Right. So honestly, the book is kind of interesting to read. I'm not going to, like I said, we're going to kind of go on to the next part here, but I think it is important as a text if you want to get a sense of what was at play here, right? Plus, also, I do like the idea that you're saying of, they want to create a Northwest Passage, and this is kind of
They
obvious.
couldn't find a Northwest Passage.
Yeah, exactly.
So they have chosen to manifest their destiny and make one.
Exactly. Right. And it's, again, explicit because they say it like, oh, we're wanting to do this so that we can bring Asian silks and goods through every part of Canada. People. And workers and people. Will certainly get into that. Right. But yeah, it's what was the line specifically? It was, damn it, I lost it.
Okay, I lost my marbles.
There we go. Yeah. So, and the highway across which the fabrics and products of Asia shall be carried to the eastern as well as to the western sides of the Atlantic. But this was the goal of the Northwest Passage, right? That famed and mythical passage. That's what we wanted, was to be able to access Asia. And now with the railway, we can. Right? So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I can't fault the book for what it's trying to talk about. Again, like, it's one of those things, and it talks about how we're in an age where this is now possible with the technology.
Yep.
I mean, I find that's a big part of it, is saying we can now do this, so let's do it.
Yeah,
which sort of shows how much propaganda it is.
Never. What was it in Jurassic Park? It's like you were so concerned about what you can do, you never thought about whether you should do it.
Well, I'm thinking about the episode of South Park where they're getting. There's one of the kids is like, he's really good at reading ads and what is an ad and what isn't. So they're showing him a bunch of images of like online articles or like, that's an ad, that's an ad, that's not an ad, that's because everything is almost just an ad these days, right? I'm like, this is an ad. This is an advertisement for the the railroad.
Yeah. The Canadian Pacific Railway. Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, I don't want to fault them because in this case, this was an expedition that was going to happen regardless. Like, I feel like this is part of, like I said, a national imperative. Whether it was Grant or Fleming, this kind of survey would have happened regardless. Maybe not in the same exact way, but it would have happened because this was a national imperative. Right?
Oh, don't misunderstand me. I'm fine with them doing this, and I think it was a good idea overall to have this railway. Like, I think in the railroad, my problem is, but it's also like, be aware of what we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. And
like, the project was a good project, sure, but
we have problems perhaps with the way it was presented or how it got done. But, yeah, absolutely. So moving our focus a little bit, I do think it is nevertheless important to give somewhat of a general historical overview of what the project entailed, right? So from the start, right, Canada confederated in 1867. We've talked to death about it. And it was already, in the minds of the politicians at the time and the people to create connected railways. Because as you were saying, technologically, that was the peak of technology at this point, was railways. It allowed soldiers, it allowed goods, it allowed people to move at high speeds across the colonies. Right? And, once British Columbia became interested in joining Confederation, then it became a continental project, right? Then suddenly we're like, okay, well, one of the deals in order to bring British Columbia into Confederation is that we're going to build the railway across the country, right? Across the continent. Folks. It's a big deal. It's a big deal, and it would go through a whole lot of problems, mostly monetary problems, right? And logistical problems. And it would become a major point of contention between British Columbia and the eastern parts of Canada that, like, look, you're not holding up to your end of the bargain. We joined Confederation, but you're not connecting us with the rest of the world, with the rest of Canada. So this is an issue.
Bring us together, not apart.
And so obviously, we've kind of touched upon this. This was mostly under the John Macdonald government. And there were some bumps along the road, and most important of which was the actual attribution of the contracts to the people who would make the railroad. Right? We kind of touched upon this in our episode on McDonald, but this is what led namely to the famous Pacific scandal in 1873, in which it was discovered that the McDonald government, and specifically McDonald himself, was subject to corruption.
Surprising no one.
Bribes and so forth. Again, nothing new under the sun. Like, bribes were a thing in 1873. They are now. It's fine. Move on.
Bribes have been a thing ever since money's been a thing.
Exactly. So forever.
Yeah.
And so despite the Pacific scandal, the Mackenzie government would still try to move forward some of the railroad. But as we saw in our episode on Mackenzie, it was more difficult because there was an economic recession, and, the Liberal government under Mackenzie was known for its indecisiveness about certain things. So, mostly the project just kind of stagnated until MacDonald returned to power in 1878, and the railroad construction was brought into high gear, mostly under what the government at the time called the national policy.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Ultimately, the contract for the CPR was awarded to to a group that was led by Donald Smith, J.J. Hill, and George Stephen, which is basically a conglomerate representing various interests, both from Montreal, Toronto. I think there were some American interests as well in there, right? Which was a huge point of contention, obviously, because if you're building a national project, you don't necessarily want Americans involved, but they decided that the actual needs of the railway surpassed any national needs in this case, right? Or nationalistic, I should say, needs. And officially, the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, as a company was incorporated in 1881, and it had a mandate to complete the CPR in 10 years. Right? To do so, right, the company had major provisions, right? So they had $25 million in cash in order to produce the project, and they were given 25 million acres, right, of land in a belt along where the railway would be built, right? So you have the railway, and plus you have land around it, right? And there was the cost of surveys that cost about $37 million, and they were given monopoly over transportation south to the United States for 20 years. Ultimately, the bill ran very, very high for this project, right? Mostly because of the actual difficult terrain on which they did, but because this was really an unprecedented scale of a project, right? Wanting to do this so fast over such a large territory, right? Larger than the American project, which had taken many years, and now they wanted to do it faster over larger. It's a nightmare, right? And ultimately, the CPR would later receive in 1884 an extra $22.5 million. But this was a loan. But yeah, an extra $22 million. So running the total amount of the railway at the time to close to $50 million just for the railway.
Just for the railway.
Yeah. And so ultimately, the actual railway did not go through the recommended route that Sanford Fleming had proposed in Ocean to Ocean and in his official report after the survey. But ultimately, the railway was completed in 1885, right? So well under the expected timeline, right, that they had. And really, the most difficult part was actually getting to BC, because most of Canada is pretty flat, right? All those prairie parts, that could go pretty quickly. But once you get into the Rocky Mountains, or when you encounter the Canadian Shield itself, right, it's very much a feat of engineering, right? To actually not just dynamite it, but actually drill through parts of the mountain in order to get this railway going. But they nevertheless
did it.
Right. So again, this is very much an overview. We're going to get into some of the details thanks to the poetry, but anything you wanted to add so far before we actually got into the poem?
The meat of today?
Yeah.
It's the railroad, so we are joking about the fact that it's one of the most identifying parts of Canadian history. But I don't think I also don't think it's also very much true.
Right.
This was a project that needed to be done. Canada as a place was still kind of shaky, and like there's always a real, as long as America remains the superpower that it is, there's always a chance that Canada will be subsumed.
Do you feel like that's still true today, though?
In a way, yes. Like I'm not. Maybe the influence is a bit less,
right?
But I still think there's a necessary wariness. Like there's a fact that, and this is also true around the world. But if the United States military ever decided one day that they needed more drinking water, what are we gonna do?
It's just like, bow down, I guess. Yeah. No, I understand what you mean. No,
like you can't be that close in proximity to a superpower
and not
without being a little bit nervous.
Sure. But I feel like you're right. In many ways, it was of vital importance at the time, right? Because if they insisted on creating the Canada that we know today, yes, it was necessary.
Well, it's also just to prove that you can. Like, it's the first great project that the nation took after the BNA Act. This was them stepping out on their own and sort of saying, I'm going to make it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to
Yep. Absolutely.
You can't. And then, so if they failed at this, they would have failed as a nation.
Yeah, exactly. And like most,
they have to move back into their Great Britain's basement or something,
and that's exactly why Grant in his introductory notes writes of Canada becoming a Greater Britain in this part, right? That's the drive in this case. And when you think about it, most of the other projects are intrinsically related to that. So we talked about the economic one, but there's the giant elephant in the room also of the indigenous populations that are there. If you're absolutely insisting on creating a white settler state, right, which is what was planned, right, you have to establish yourself as a superpower through a certain way. And that's how you do it by, in this case, and this is not a coincidence why I'm mentioning it, giving land to a private enterprise like the CPR, with which they can do whatever they want with, right? And in this case, that allows for the dispossession of indigenous populations and the settlement of other populations.
Yeah, and it's just the old saying goes that good roads are the backbone of civilization.
Yep.
The roads of Rome were famous for their engineering, the construction of which, and they've become the world standard by which the rest of the world functions.
Right. Or at least the ones near and around the actual city of Rome.
Yeah.
But
it's you can't kind of underscore the need for a national railway.
Right.
If you're trying to have any sort of claims of saying like we are one people.
Absolutely.
How can you be one people if you can't even get to all the people easily?
Exactly. But then obviously you create this whole issue of like, well, what is the one people, right? Because
I'm not saying it doesn't have its faults.
No. But that's the goal, as you were saying. Absolutely. So, okay. Today we're talking a little bit about the major work of literature that we're going to be talking about today is perhaps a classic in CanLit. I think it's a classic.
Yeah.
By E.J. Pratt, Edward James, I think. Edward John. Hold on. I should have looked
British fucking name. Edward James Pratt.
Edwin. I'm sorry. Edwin John Pratt.
Edwin. Oh, it got worse.
It's like a more pretentious version of Edward.
That's a Pratt for you, like.
Don't laugh at Edwin. My grandfather was named. Oh no, Edwin. Sorry.
No, it's the fact it's Edwin John Pratt.
That's true.
Like you're a Pratt. Like you are a Pratt as in slang word Pratt at that point.
Yeah, absolutely. But
the name Edwin on its own is fine.
No, so E.J. Pratt is kind of like a powerhouse, I think a major figure in the study of Canadian poetry and Canadian literature. And today we're talking about his 1952 work, Towards the Last Spike, right, which is explicitly about the construction and idea of the railway. And he actually, the subtitle for the work is A Verse Panorama of the Building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And the term verse panorama here, I think, is one that we can kind of perhaps pay attention to a bit later. But a little bit on Pratt, who honestly, I think we'll do a whole episode on it when we get into the 30s, 40s, and 50s when he was operating. But He is an interesting figure. So he was born in Western Bay, Newfoundland, but he was moved around a lot by his father, who was a minister, a Methodist minister. And often every 4 years, his family would move along the outports of the British colony of Newfoundland. Right. Mm-hmm. And Pratt himself served as a preacher and was a teacher in several remote island communities. And eventually he attended Victoria College, University of Toronto, and was a major in philosophy. Right. And he would support his studies by doing missionary work. Yeah, he did missionary work in the west of Canada and in the summers, and later served as an assistant minister just outside of Toronto. And in 1911, he earned his BA and an MA in 1912, which I think is the most metal thing because his thesis was on demonology, which is absolutely awesome.
He got his MA in a year?
Yeah.
What the fuck?
I don't know how he did it. But
I guess it was just different.
I guess
that days.
I guess he either the class load was not as big for MAs, or he just like powered through his thesis, which I once again want to stress was on demonology.
Yeah, that's whatever, it's demonology. Good for him. It's as useful as philosophy major,
I guess.
I'm just more like in a year. That's the impressive part.
He earned a BD also, which I'm not sure what that is. A BD in 1913, so a year after his MA, another degree. And he earned a PhD, at least this time he took an actual 4 years to do it. He earned a PhD in 1917.
Fucking scrub lord.
In theology, right? Okay. He published his thesis on studies in Pauline eschatology and its background, which sounds boring as all hell.
Yeah, but we talk about Canadian history, so who are we to judge?
Come on, you should know by now after 80 episodes that it's much more interesting than that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I find is, I don't know, maybe I didn't get this sense, but I don't feel like his work in theology necessarily informed this particular work of Towards the Last Spike, but I do think it has informed other works of his, right? Mm-hmm. He has addressed, religion or theology in a wider sense, right? The more metaphysical questions. He has addressed that in his other poetry. Okay, I guess the best way to start this, because I know you have thoughts on this book. What are your what do you make of this text in general, right? Because as we said, it's about the building of the railway.
Yeah, it's about the building of the railway, but it's much more, and I get, again, it's one of those things like, oh, this is an ad.
Okay, interesting. Even though it was written 100 years after the railway was finished?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're still, again, because it's still trying to promote that idea of Canadian identity, Canadian exceptionalism almost.
Yeah.
The way this whole thing is framed, as you sort of have in the notes, and it's very odd. Like, I've read the opening parts to this, but not much
it's
further
a long
because
poem. Yeah.
It's a long poem, first of all. It's also, you get the idea pretty quickly.
Yeah. For people, by the way, who don't necessarily have the poem in front of them, it's linked in the description, but the book version of it is 55 pages long, right? So it is a long poem.
But the length isn't almost the issue. It's, you start reading it and it was the same world then as now, the same except for little differences of speed and power and means to treat myopia, to show an axe blade infinitely sharp, splitting things infinitely small, or else. Provide the telescopic sight to roam to curved dominions that were found in fables, the same, but for new particles of speech, those algebraic substitutes for nouns, the sky photographers would hang like signboards along the trespass of our thoughts to stop the stutters of our tongues with their equations. Like he's obviously making a call for this older time, as is often the case, this great time of Canadianism, Canadian nationalism,
which was also rising by the time that he was writing this in the 50s.
Yep, and this epic feel, to put a point on it.
Yeah. So
to use the term written in the notes.
But we'll get into the epic part. But I must say, I love the opening of this poem. Right. I think it really sets the tone for what the rest of the poem is going to be. Plus, it has Pratt's signature kind of tongue-in-cheek feel to it, right? Everything was the same, except not really. Everything was different, right? Because it was like in this case, so 1952 to 1885, it wasn't 100 years per se, it was like 75 years, but still, you still get that sense that he's kind of being playful with it almost, right? But nevertheless, immediately bringing the imagination back to a time when there were still a lot of changes to be had. And this is the story of one of those major changes, right? And I think that's an extremely efficient way to do it, especially considering that this poem is so long that he's able to elicit these thoughts and sentiments within just like a single 10-line stanza, right? And I think that's really interesting in this case. Okay, so the epic, right?
Epic.
Would you mind telling our listeners what an epic is exactly? Why? And then we'll kind of, I think that'll help us define why this is.
How do you explain?
Because
first, you have to understand epic.
Lit questions 101.
An epic is big.
Yes.
Person, like it's grand is even a better word to describe it. You're trying to make this big piece of literature as like a novel, play, poem, whatever, that is trying to have an all-encompassing theme around it.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, one of the most famous ones is Beowulf.
Yep, that's true.
Which is it's an epic poem that basically encompasses the entire idea of manliness and manhood at the time, the ideals of being a warrior.
It's very much often a heroic journey. Yeah, absolutely.
Another big famous one is the Odyssey.
Yep, the Iliad.
The Iliad, or if you want to go in a more modern epic for novels, would be the Ulysses.
Sure. But
this big like this novel that talks about a lot, or there's a lot, like it's not that the Ulysses is necessarily super long, but it's dense, right? You've read it, Patrick. It's a dense book.
It is dense.
Doing this big, grandiose, or almost tongue-in-cheek grandiose story, this grand idea.
Yeah. And I think in many ways, I know this was perhaps a contentious argument depending on like where you fall in the questions of literature, but I think comic books are perhaps a good contemporary example of this. Not necessarily
depending on the comic.
Yes, obviously depending on the comic. So for example, I would say perhaps a well-written Superman story is perhaps a good example of an epic.
Yeah, if you want like the one, it's the epics are the stories that last. They're the stories that we remember. They're the stories that all other stories put themselves around and base themselves off of to try and rewrite.
Yes.
And Alan Moore wrote The Killing Joke, and it has become the Batman story that most other Batmen base themselves off of.
Sure. Yeah. But also I feel like the comic book analogy in this case is apt because I believe epics are about surpassing yourself in many ways, right? That's the whole point when we were talking about heroic journeys. In the Odyssey, Odysseus,
you're trying to mythologize something.
Yeah,
you're trying to make something into a legend.
Exactly.
An epic is a great way to you're trying to imbue something with this legendary status and this legendary figure. It's not, it's not your more pulpy books, which are fine. Like they're great books and all that, but you're not imbuing this idea or that like James Cameron's Titanic.
Sure.
It turns the story and the event of the Titanic sinking into this. It's a huge event. It's been mythologized now. It's been this legendary sort of thing that happened over 100. This epic tragedy.
Yep. And I think I think that's a good comparison here with the Titanic because famously the Titanic movie is not exactly a work of fact or historical fact, right? He, for those who might not know, like he takes some liberties with the actual history.
Yeah, and
I think that's
he's one of the better ones when it came to the Titanic, though. He's actually much better than a lot of other instances of the Titanic.
Absolutely, but I think it's still important to mention because I think part of the epic is that
it's not supposed to be a true story.
It's not supposed to be a true story. And even if it is based in history, as people believe the Iliad, for example, to be, or as
you are actively trying to embellish it, to make it a legendary act of fiction.
Exactly. Right. You're trying to instill an image in people's minds.
You're trying to create something that's beyond the realm of the possible and the realm of possibilities. You're trying to create something that goes beyond that.
Right. Absolutely. So with that in mind, why is this an epic poem?
Because it is trying to create this legendary status around this great Canadian event. And I mean great insofar that it was a grand, like it is one of the defining moments of Canada.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like the legend of, well, it's almost like the moment when Canada waited specifically like 8 or 12 hours after Great Britain declared war on Germany just to say that they did, to show the fact that they could do that now after the Westminster Agreement.
Yep, absolutely. And, you know, I think also just in the way that Pratt decides to, not just in the subject matter, but in the very way that he writes about the railway, I think is framed as an epic, right? Because, you know, there are heroes and villains in this very clearly, right? And this is one of perhaps my issues with it, and one of the issues of other poets who will write afterwards and who we'll talk about later. It's very much a history that's focused on the great men of history, right?
Oh, yeah.
This poem is one that talks about John A. Macdonald, again, talks about Edward Blake, talks about
John A. Macdonald.
Yeah, it talks about, what's his face? Mackenzie and Van Horn, that's the name I was looking for. Van Horn, George Stephen, Donald Smith, all of these people who are associated as the major players in the CPR's construction, right? They're the group, the Odysseus group, if you will.
They're the Argonauts.
The Argonauts, thank you. Yes.
They're the Argonauts, McDonald's Jason.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, honestly, they are the soldiers of legend.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm trying to find a specific passage in which that would kind of demonstrate this, right? Yeah, in a sense.
And as now, so then, blood kept its ancient color and smoothly, roughly placed its banks, in calm preserving them, in riot rupturing them. Wounds needed bandages and stomachs food. The hands outstretched had joined the lips in prayer. Give us our daily bread, give us our pay. The past flushed and present and tomorrow would dawn upon today. Only the rate to sensitize or numb a nerve would change. Like, this language is very much trying to create a sense of, I don't want to say epicness, but it's trying to create this large sense. You know, this was a battlefield almost. There was wounds that needed bandaging. This was a fight. This was a struggle. This is a great struggle, you know. And then even the way he tries to, blood kept its ancient color. He's trying to create this idea of old. He's trying to put you in this mindset of this great past event that happened.
Absolutely. In the not far from where you read it, so this is on page 2 of mine, so a few lines down, right? If not the universe, the feel of it was in the air, quote, union required the line. The theme was current at the banquet tables, and arguments profane and sacred rent God-fearing families into partisans. Pulpit, platform, and floor were sounding boards. Cushions beneath the pounding fists assumed the hues of western sunsets. Nostrils sniffed, the prairie tang, the tongue rolled over the texts. Right. Again, very much pointing to this idea that you're talking about. Have you read, this is the part I was looking for. The page after, just in the section called The Gathering, I think kind of points to this, to the greatness in many ways of these people that we're following, right? And so we read here at the start of The Gathering, oatmeal was in their blood and in their names. Thrift was the title of their catechism. It governed all things but their mess of porridge, which, when it struck the hydrochloric acid with treacle and skim milk, became a mash. Entering the duodenum, it broke up into amino acids. Then the liver took on its natural job as carpenter. I'm just going to skip here a few. Eyebrows came out as gorse, the beards as thistles, and the chest hair the fell of Grampian rams. It stretched and vulcanized the human span. Nonagenarians worked and thrived upon it, out of such chemistry run through by genes. So for those of you who perhaps weren't necessarily following what this is, right? He's describing the Scottish people that are involved with this project, including MacDonald himself, but he's specifically constructing them as, manly men, right, who eat porridge and who have like this great chest hair, right? No, but like that's Kimmy's laughing in the background that like they're eating porridge. but like they're eating like this heavy and hearty stuff is what I meant.
It's the idea that they're eating. It's not that they're eating porridge. It's that they're eating gruel.
They're
Again,
eating
it's building.
gruel. Yes.
It's the struggle.
It's the
that they were not feasting. They were living hard lives. They were living off the land. They were living.
Yes, exactly it.
They weren't like the fops drinking wine, eating cheese and crackers. That's the sort of the idea is like these lines are about building this idea that they are the Canadian man in nature. They're living almost with nature. They're roughing it. They're rough and tumble world where they are just trying to do this. They're trying to finish this great project.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That will live and surpass them. That will go beyond them.
Yes. Right. And you kind of see this after, and specifically alluding to war in this case, where a few stanzas down, their names were like a battle muster: Angus and Fleming, Hector and Dawson, Cromarty Ross and Beatty, Bruce Allen, Galt, Douglas and the Trois, Stephen and Smith. Right. So all of these are, we're framing this almost as a war or a conquest of what we'll later find out are the villains, right?
Bum, bum, bum.
The mountains themselves, right? The mountains and the prairies are very much framed throughout the poem as this monster to be defeated. It's the Hydra, if you will, of this
tale.
And I think this is a good comparison in this case, or at least what was the one? It wasn't the Hydra. Scylla and Charybdis, isn't it?
Right. Yeah.
Where it was literally a mountain. On the one side, you had a mountain with a monster on it, and the other side, you had the roaring waves, right? In which the whirlpool monster, thank you, through which Odysseus had to
you have to pass through there to get through, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think again, Pratt is very intentionally pulling from these classical images in order to build his narrative, right? We need to conquer these monsters in order to make sure that these heroes establish their place in history, right? And I think that's perhaps segueing into another topic, right, about this is very much about making history, right? And I think that's a big part of the whole idea of an epic and a narrative of this narrative in general is like, we want to make our names set in stone. And the way to do this is by building the railway. Right.
Become better than who and what we are.
Exactly. Right. And, in this case, I saw one critic specifically mention that the antagonists were both a lack of will and inadequate vision, right? And so that's one of the things that makes the project go slower, right? Sectionalism that's happening, right? The lack of desire of driving forward, right? And often in the poem, that's kind of demonstrated by people like Mackenzie, who are demonstrated as being more fuddy-duddies, right? To use
we're just a bunch of fuddy-duddies. I'm just a big old fuddy-duddy.
Right. But also, I think, and this is perhaps more of an interesting one to talk about, right? Another critic was saying that it's the external heavyweight of time that's demonstrated by the Laurentian shield and the vast intractability of matter, so the Rocky Mountains, that is also an antagonist. And I think that's much more compelling as an argument. And you can see this later in the poem. I just copied this into the notes because it was, I think, really good line. As grim an enemy as rock was time, the little men from 5 to 6 feet high, from 3 to 4 score years in lease of breath, were flung in double front against them both. In years a billion strong, so long was it, since brachiopods in mollusk habitats were clamping shells on weeds in ocean mud, now only yesterday. So, and there's almost a suggestion, right, that it's a glorious path, but also it's kind of absurd, right? What's happening, because you're contrasting the small men, right? These people who are 5 to 6 feet high and 30 or 40 years old, and you're going up against something that's billions of years old, right? And so there is this inevitable absurdity to it, to this monumental task. And I feel like this very much points to what this critic was saying. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting which critic I pulled it from, but of both time and matter being the antagonists, right? And it's represented by the shield, the Laurentian shield in the Rocky Mountains, but on a greater scale, it's time and matter.
Time, matter, time and space.
But again, like, I think this points to what we were saying about Fleming at the beginning of the episode, right? In this case, we're not only conquering space, but we're literally having to change the way that we understand time in order to make this endeavor possible, right? We need to think about the way that each people perceive time at a specific moment, or how we understand our place in history, right? Which is a form of time. I don't know.
No, and it's this idea of the forces that we face and how we fight, or I'm going to butcher what I'm trying to say here, but there's a very real point to be made that humans, we are only so finite, and projects, people may not believe in them as they go. And so you need to have these people that will then continue on you're leaving this legacy. This legacy that the project must be finished, that the project must be respected.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in many ways, as you were saying, there are a lot of interesting paradoxes to be had in this poem. And we can talk about the paradoxes that are inherent in nationalism, right? Because I think, as you were saying before, this is a major part of this work. Right. But also the very way, just to finish up on this point in particular, the very way that land is talked about, right, in the poem is almost a bit of a paradox, because it's simultaneously personified, right? Throughout the poem, Pratt uses terms like jealous, or it's surprised, or he even describes it as female in many ways, which we can maybe deconstruct a bit. But also the land is described as too old for death and too old for life, right? It's this inanimate thing, right? That so it's simultaneously something that has a mind of its own that can stop this project from occurring, but ultimately it doesn't. I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but because of its inanimacy, right? Pratt is ascribing also this inanimacy to it that makes it justified, or makes it possible to conquer it. Right. And I think that's interesting. I don't know if there's much to say about this, but yeah, here we go. Here's the lines that I was talking about, right? And listen, note the monstrous vocabulary here.
Do it.
This folded reptile was asleep or dead. So motionless she seemed stone dead, just seemed. She was too old for death, too old for life. For as if jealous of all living forms, she had lain there before bivalves began to catacomb their shells on western mountains. So, yeah, some of it is a bit weird. Like, I see your eyes squinting of like, I don't know what that means.
Wait, what? It was a lizard?
But that's the thing, right? In this case, the Laurentian shield is demonstrated as almost like this great dragon, right? This great reptile that's to be defeated.
I mean, Canada has always had that funny relationship with its land. Our belief in the superiority of our land. Yeah. Where with it that we can, how can I say this? Where we believe we use the land in this great way, that Canada has a strong connection to the land. We are the masters of the land around us, and nature is an important part of that, Yeah. And so it doesn't surprise me that that's what came up within this idea, I guess, this frame, this culture.
Absolutely. It is this poem and others at the time, including Grant, by the way, who we mentioned at the start, would very much be a proponent of land-based nationalism, right? But at the same time, and this is what I think is kind of tongue-in-cheek about Pratt's poem and appreciative, like Pratt still stresses the alienness of the land. Right. It's supposed to be a home for a new nation. That's what the goal is. But there's still something that's not quite, how can I say, not necessarily achievable, but understandable about it. Right. And in many ways, that kind of does represent what a nation is. Right. It's this idea. It's something that we want to grasp for. But like, if you ask someone to define it, it's very difficult, or you'll get a very different answer from one person to another as to what that is, especially, I think, here in Canada.
Yeah, well, especially just for how do I say this? How nation is discussed and what we believe the nation of Canada is.
Right. So I think in many ways,
most people in Canada almost would say that a nation is a bad thing.
yeah, absolutely. And I think this idea of land-based nationalism is perhaps a way to come to terms with that there is a slipperiness to identifying nation as racial in some sense, right? There's obviously a slipperiness to that type of idea.
For sure.
But I think that's what Pratt is trying to do here, is by identifying the land as the source of nationhood in this sense, or at least something on which to build nation, it provides a kind of common ground and which a lot of people can identify with, at least at the time that he's writing, or at the time that the railroad is being built, right? So it's obviously there, you can poke holes in it. I think that, land does mean different things for different people. We can talk to, indigenous peoples about that, obviously, or just other people from, I'm in Montreal, and obviously land doesn't mean the same thing to me as someone who lives perhaps on the prairies of Saskatchewan, right? But I think that's kind of what Pratt is trying to do, is to create this middle ground, or at least this central theme that he can go for. Did you have anything else that you wanted to add about this poem that you wanted to mention specifically? I'm just going to mute myself rapidly, but go ahead if you had anything else that you wanted to add
about this large poem. It's an interesting effort, and it's a case of people in Canada trying to say that Canada is this thing, which kind of undercuts the message of it.
Yeah.
Canada is trying to say this is a great grand event of the railroad, blah, blah, blah. It's like, you don't need to say that, though. People will know that anyway.
Right. But I feel like
if you no, but it's to me, it links back to what Canada does a lot. Like when we talk about the Canadian literary canon, you look at the reports, and if Canada has to keep saying it has a grand literary canon, it kind of undercuts the value of whatever canon may exist.
Right. Absolutely.
And so to say it was a grand event, you don't need to then write this great long poem to try and reinforce that idea. You can instead talk about it in a different way.
Interesting. We can maybe, this is outside a bit of the purview of this particular episode, but when we talk about Pratt on his own episode, I do think it might be important to wonder why he was interested in making this narrative the way it is. Like, I don't think, because at that point that would be talking about the 50s, right? But I do think it's the railway had been a part of the national mythology for some time in Canada, so I assume he didn't write it just for shits and giggles.
No, right? But again, when he does write, it's the same way we Canada tried in place. For example, it's participation in certain battles of World War I.
Yeah,
like it's been 100 years since then, but we're still talking about it.
That's true.
And we're still trying again to mythologize it and put it into this grand Canadian legend.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I think there's a similar thing going, like, it was over 100 years ago, but that doesn't stop the fact that people can still beat it like a dead horse.
That's true. So one of the things I want to mention in this case, right, is everything that's not mentioned in this poem.
Love it.
Right. So I think it's an important part, because as we mentioned, this work, despite its, positive statements, I do think, aside from a few lines here and there that are a bit awkward, I think it's a well-written poem. I think Pratt deserves attention as a poet. Right. And we can't give him his just due in this episode in particular, but I think he's worth mentioning and worth conserving. I do think, however, that he has a lot of blind spots, right? So, and I think here there's a line in towards the last spike that opens up to what I mean here, right? Okay, here we go. Sorrow is stalking through the camps. He's talking about the work camps in this case. Speaking a common mother tongue. 'Twill leave tomorrow to turn that language on a Blackfoot teepee, then take its leisurely Pacific time to top its fingers on a coolie's door. Okay, there are two races mentioned here, Blackfoot, and what's a coolie, Mac?
I don't know. What is a coolie?
It's a derogative term for an unskilled Chinese laborer.
Oh, okay. Oh, I knew a different word for them.
Oh, yes, I think we've mentioned that one before. What was it, like a zipperhead or something like that? Yeah. Both horrible terms, by the way.
Well, you want to know? So, okay, it was coined by the U.S. during the Korean War.
Okay. So right around the time, actually, that Pratt would have been writing this. So there you go.
Okay, I thought it was anyway.
But in this case, this is the only moment that Pratt mentions in Chinese populations, and it's through a racist term. And this is one of the only times where he actually mentions indigenous populations, right?
And again, that plays into my like belief of this trying to mythologize this event more. You're actively trying to sweep under the rug the importance that these laborers played and the fact of how horrible the treatment was.
Absolutely.
Like his poem where the rough men were struggling and they ate oatmeal is a much better picture than what actually happened.
Right. Absolutely. So in response to this, I think we can start with the with the Chinese populations. Sorry. There's a poem that was written in 1966, right? So not long after, about 10 years after this, towards the last spike, by a contemporaries of Pratt's named F.R. Scott, who's a poem from Montreal, very well recognized poet, who also deserves his own episode and will get one. But F.R. Scott was much more concerned with bringing back the voices of the common people into his poetry and history. So he was a lawyer, poet, and founder of what we now know as the NDP in Canada, right? Or co-founder of what now is known as the NDP. At the time, it was the CCF. And he writes this small poem, which is called All the Spikes But the Last. And it's not a long poem, so I think we can read it out in full. Where are the coolies in your poem, Ned? Where are the thousands from China who swung their picks with bare hands at 40 below? Between the first and the million other spikes, they drove, and the dressed-up act of Donald Smith, who sung their story. Did they fare so well in the land they helped to unite? Did they get one of the 25 million CPR acres? Is all Canada has to say to them written in the Chinese Immigration Act? So much more direct, perhaps, than Pratt was in his poetry. This is not an epic poem at all by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's an important one. And, he's kind of pointing to the fact that Pratt didn't mention the Chinese people at all, right? But he also alludes to the, as you're saying, the historic railroading, I guess, that the Chinese
well
suffered.
Also the land stealing, all those acres that they get any? No, of course not.
No, and this is another thing that we didn't really mention, but those 25 million acres that the CPR got outside of just the acreage for the railroad was specifically meant for profit motives, right? It was to be able to recoup some of the costs so that they could sell that land to settlers, right? And obviously you could sell it at a higher profit because it was right by the transportation of the railway. Right. But as Scott is saying here, the Chinese not alone and never weren't even given the right to buy the land, right, at this point, because out of the 15,000 Chinese laborers that were tasked with building the railway, they barely got paid, and barely got paid, sometimes not even on time, sometimes not at all, right? But also a lot of them, there's about 600 that are estimated to have died in working on the railway. And a lot of them were actually just kicked out of the country afterwards, right? They were brought in for the specific purpose of building the railway, and then they were chuffed off, right?
Chuffed off. They were kicked to the curb, cast aside.
They kind of were, right? They were not seen as welcome. They were seen as alien in this country. And that's kind of, at best, you could see maybe Pratt's poem, if you're really offering a generous reading of it, you could see him as deliberately ignoring them because of the fact that the Canadian government and the Canadian project ignored him.
Yep.
But I don't, considering the rest of what we were talking about and how he frames this poem, I don't see that as happening or being the case. Right. So this is really a generous reading of it. But yeah. So, and as we were saying, right, the employment of Chinese workers would actually cause controversy, particularly in British Columbia, because, again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Politicians were worried about the economic and cultural impact of having a bunch of immigrants from China coming over to their province. So, it is what it is. But I do think what's important, and this is something that we should talk about a little bit, is the famous photograph, right?
Let's do it.
That's associated with the poem, with Scott's poem, right? The one that he mentions here. Have you ever
Where's the
seen the
picture?
last? I don't think I think I forgot to link
Ugh.
it. Yeah,
How am I supposed to react to it?
look up the last spike photo on online. So you should see
Oh,
an
is this
old
the
man.
collection of white dudes standing around while they hammer in the last spike?
Yes, yes, it is the collection of white dudes standing around.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
the dude that you see here that's actually swinging the hammer is Donald Smith, the one that Scott mentions in his poem. Right?
Okay.
And surrounding him are Sanford. I think Sanford Fleming is the one just behind him, the other one with the white beard, right? And as you're saying, just a bunch of white workers around them, right? Now, what's interesting about this poem is that this picture is that, okay, this baron, one of the financiers of the railroad, came in and stood for a photo in order to, secure his place in history, right? As the one who drove in the last spike, right? Funny enough, it actually didn't work the first time and they had to do it again because he was just not good at driving in a spike. But
Whatever.
The picture kind of ignores that, obviously. But also for the picture, the Chinese workers were specifically removed from the surrounding area before the picture was taken, right? And I think if we want to imagine what Pratt's Towards the Last Spike and what the national image of the last spike or the railroad means, I think that context for the picture that you're seeing here is vitally important, right? Because it's a manufactured history, right? It's very much manicured for a specific, in this case, it's, probably propaganda in this case, right? But it is nevertheless the image that a lot of people have in mind of the railroad. And there are other pictures, to be fair. There are pictures of the Chinese workers, like their presence is acknowledged in official documentation, right? But, the actual picture that people imagine is just doesn't acknowledge them at all.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add about this picture or anything, but I do think it is important to at least address the famous one.
Oh, and again, it's the framing. It's one of those things where it's almost how it's being framed is the reason for its existence.
Exactly. Yep. Okay. Anything you wanted to add about the Chinese workers in this case, how they got screwed over and barely paid and that they deserve much more credit than they actually do get?
I mean, just to connect to Pop Canada, where we also talked about immigration in Canada, I think it goes to show the unseen foundations of the nation are the underpaid immigrants that are often shuffled and pushed aside and swept under the rug.
Yep.
And so this grand event of Canada was done not by Canadians.
That's true. Or mostly not. Yeah.
The day-to-day grunt work was mostly not done by Canadians. So I think there's a statement there that to be made about how we treat them and how if we really want to consider what the national identity is, we really have to re-examine just how much of our nation was founded on the backs of others. The same way that the states must acknowledge that its nation was founded on the backs of slaves and slavery.
Absolutely. In many ways, ours too as well.
Yep.
Absolutely. So the last thing I want to mention here, and this is the indigenous populations. We're going to talk about them briefly here, but the reason why we're not doing a full episode, or at least we're not talking about them significantly here, is because I think this leads directly into what I want to be our next episode, right? And then we'll be able to flesh out a bit more the full implications that this has for indigenous populations. But we've kind of talked about this many times on the show, right? The treaties that the Canadian and British governments signed with the indigenous populations, or forced the indigenous populations into, directly helped or enabled the construction of the CPR, right? And were deliberately, chosen in specific spots where the CPR would be able to pass, right, as a thing. So to whoever says that this was not something planned and deliberately orchestrated is full of shit.
They don't get it, man.
And, as we were saying before, the CPR got a lot of land and so was specifically able to to flood the former indigenous lands with new settlers. And so you're kind of intrinsically relating immigration and settlement to capitalistic purposes, in this case for the CPR.
Yep.
And it allowed them to develop tourism as well, because there were specific tours that were organized. And some of them were really gross because some of the tourists were able to see quote unquote true natives, right? Or as they were.
Oh, no.
Yep. That was, by the way, a part of the tourism. Like, hey, look at these people on reserves.
See a native.
Yep, absolutely. So there's very much not only this sense that's intrinsically a part of the CPR of dispossessing the indigenous people, but then using them and turning them and co-opting them into an image, right? And there's obviously a lot of historical irony to present, the Great Railroad and using the great image of the railroad to show poor indigenous peoples on reservations, right? Now, the reason why I want to wait till the next episode to develop this fully is because the construction and finalizing of the Canadian Pacific Railway would be, I think, directly related to what kickstarted the next Louis Riel-led rebellion, which is commonly known as the Northwest Rebellion, which happened in 1885, right as the CPR was being finished, right? And I don't think it's a coincidence, right? It was the CPR is not the only thing that pushed it, but I think it was one of the things that kind of helped instigate this rebellion against the Canadian government by Indigenous populations. And that's why it's probably going to be one of our next episodes, if not the next one, right? Is because I think these things are intrinsically related, right? So I need to take a quick break, but before, I just need to finish one last question, and I'll let you answer it while I go and come back, Mac. We've kind of talked about the railroad as a powerful symbol throughout this thing, right?
Yes.
I'm curious for you, do you feel like it's still a powerful symbol today?
In the world of communication technologies and digital, the way we're connected to each other is different than the way we connected to each other 100 years ago. So I don't think things like railroads are so big, unless the railroad is like if you created the first ever electric railroad. Now, if I'm going to change that up a little bit, I think Canada's accomplishments would be better off if they examined, how to say this, if we looked at new accomplishments, or if we looked at how Canada might be able to change that railroad and update it. Now, as for the event itself and how it lives in the Canadian conscious, I don't think it was that big of a deal to people in the first place. Yeah, it was a very important thing that helped to establish and create our idea of what is Canada and what it means to live and transport ourselves in Canada. I don't think that it's something that many people honestly know about, or that they know and interact with. I did my little spiel.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah. Personally, I don't feel like it's as big of a symbol as it used to be.
That's basically what I was saying while you were gone.
Nice.
I was basically saying that in the new way that we understand connection and how people connect to each other, we connect digitally now, so it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
It would be a bigger deal if it was like a fully electric railway, or if it was.
Yeah. That's always something that I find kind of interesting, is like, for a country that, saw its rise and peak, or not necessarily its peak, but its continued expansion with ostensibly a form of public transit, right? It is always wild to me that we didn't develop that more, right? I know historically why we didn't, right? But it's like one of these weird historical ironies for me of like, literally for such a long time, it was the thing, right? And, the fact that there's such a major part of the population of Canada that lives on the border in a relatively straight line from one place to another, and that there isn't like high-speed trains between these places is madness to me.
Well, yeah, the strip, right? Like all of Canada exists in that one strip, and you can just it's almost a straight fucking line.
Yeah, and it's not like we haven't done it before. Literally, they did it 150 years ago. And it worked. So I don't know. It's at this point, this is a choice that we made as a society to not pursue that project. But
that's also any country related to, what was it? Work, the with the eco projects, you know?
Yes.
It's always a choice.
That's true. Absolutely. It's a choice, but like also in the 50s, like actually not long after Pratt would write this poem, there was the Auto Pact here in Canada that created better conditions for bringing American cars in and deliberately manufacturing or helping manufacture American cars. And so it definitely helped the rise of the automobile here in Canada, right? Rather than public transit, which used to be much more developed than it is today.
Right.
All right. Is there anything in general that you want to finish with about this episode?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I think this was
an
a good
important
episode.
Project. It's always been an important project. It's an important thing to know about, and I think it's another indicator of just how Canada views its history. Our grand event was building a railroad.
Our next grand event is going to be a world war.
Yay!
No, that's gonna. I would argue it's our next episode, the Northwest Rebellion. So there you go.
Yay!
Much less. I don't know. Whatever. All that
Take
said,
us away, Johnny.
Thanks everyone for listening. As usual, please send in a question, a comment, or anything that you want to our Facebook page, Twitter, through email. If you want to support the show, you can donate through PayPal, kind of pay what you feel the show is worth type of thing. Through affiliate links, you can obviously support us through Patreon, which, as we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, allows for ad-free episodes. It allows for your access to Pop Canada, which is an excellent show, right? And as always, this is entirely optional. This show is going to remain free for anyone who does not want to support us that way, and that's totally okay, right? And finally, if you could leave a review on iTunes or on Spotify, you can leave reviews on both of those platforms, and just share the show with some friends. Just get it out there.
Get it out there.
There you go.
Send the word out, man.
Absolutely. So with that being said, thank you once again, Mac, for joining me on another fantastic episode of Historia Canadiana. We'll see you all next time.
Cheers.